Good evening. Before we all get started with Keith's talk, I thought I'd give thanks to a few people here. First of all, do we have any board members from the Port Aransas Preservation and Historical Association here tonight? I think we have at least one. There we go. Philip over there, is that it? Just Philip? And also, so this is one of our activities we do for the Port Aransas Preservation and Historical Association. Richard over here also is one of our board members. And you know, we're planning on doing 7 of these all the way through the 3rd week of February. Although in February we're moving to the Patton Center because this will be under construction, so I thought I'd get that in right away. And next week is Mark Creighton will be talking about the strong women of the islands. So we've got a pretty good lineup, and of course there were some. And also, I like all the volunteers at the Farley Boat Works in the museum to please stand up, because we like to thank you for all the great things that you all do. It's quite a bit of it. And I'm Cliff Strain. That's Ashley Harris over there to the left, our Chief Operating Officer. And if you're a member of Port Aransas Preservation and Historical Association, just raise your hand. Quite a few. Very good. And Mark is actually, he's a board member emeritus and one of our founding people for the organization. So also, if you have a cell phone, you may want to silence it, you know, just like in church. That way it won't go off when we're recording. And we're really excited to start off our first lecture with Keith Farley giving a talk on the Farley family. And that's a major undertaking, and I hope he'll be able to, you know, he's not a professional speaker, but he is an authority on the Farley family. And that family, from when they first showed up in the 1600s to today, splintered out in so many different directions. They probably take 3 or 4 lectures to cover them all. And even just last week, we had a guy named, do you know Karsten Farley? Huh? Karsten Farley? There was a Farley that showed up at the museum that recognized certain people in the tree.
He could have, you know, he's different. We got relatives all.
Yeah, it's just amazing how far the Farleys. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Keith Farley. And if you have any questions, please hold them to the end. He'll be happy to answer. He's also got a lot of really cool stuff. We brought his model that he made, and it's done down to the individual plank. Everything is, you know, to detail. He also has the Times Magazine article that had FDR's visit, and just a ton of photos. We thought we were going to have a document viewer to show some of these, but we're just going to go with a slideshow, and he may hold some stuff up, may pass some stuff around, but you know, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
Is it working? Okay.
Ooh, that a little too close. Okay. Well, I turn the volume down a little bit. Well, first off, like I said, I'm not a professional speaker. When I was in high school in my speech class, I used to get up in front of my class and give my speech, and the teacher would ask, "Where's my written work at?" I said, "Well, I have it in the class," because I hadn't written it out yet. I just talked. And I've always made a good grade. And like I said, the family came over from England in 1623. It was on the 3rd ship after the Mayflower to James City, Virginia. And Thomas and Anne came over. Thomas and Jane came over. Anne was her first child. He was a member of the House of Burgess in Virginia 3 different times, representing the different plantations around Archer's Hope and Martin's 100. And we're descended down from, I think it's 11th to 12th child that they had. One of them was executed because of his part in the Bacon Rebellion. You have to be a history buff to know what that was. And one of them got killed by Indians, and it's just, back then it was weird stuff. Yeah. Then they come on down. One of their sons, Stephen E., that's who we're from, he came with Georgia and other part of Florida, Alabama, and then he went up to Mississippi, to a little county up in the southwestern corner, and with his wife, and then they had 3 boys there. There was James, William Augustus, who our family descended from, and another one, Ellington. Then in 1815, him and some other gentlemen built a raft and floated down the Mississippi to New Orleans and fought with Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans. And then he went back up there and then back to Florida where he grew up. His son, William Augustus, was a carpenter, built boats. He has a patent from a device that he built to lay out the ships from the plans and stuff. And he sailed over to Pensacola in April and to try to interest the shipyard over there in his device, but we don't know what happened with it because he drowned coming back. And nobody knew much about it. There was only one survivor of the boat, and the reason he survived is because he did what my grandfather told him to do: lash yourself to the mast. And they drifted to shore. There was another guy with him that was just barely hanging on, and he kept talking to him, and as soon as the guy touched, his feet touched the shore, well, he hollered back, "We're saved." The guy was gone. There was just the one survivor. And his oldest son, James William, worked for the lighthouse service, and he was a carpenter, boat builder also. He traveled from Key West all the way around to Port Isabel, working on the lighthouses, the keeper's quarters, whatever maintenance had to be done. And he had broken a leg, and he got hooked on laudanum, which is bad stuff back then, but it was easy to do. And he just, he gathered his family up, and he moved to Comanche, Texas, to dry out, and that's where Charles Frederick was born. He was named after after James Williams' brothers. He died of mumps up in Comanche. This is a picture, well, that was a picture. That's a picture of my grandfather, James William, and my grandmother, Annie Elizabeth Sims. This was probably taken in I believe it was taken in Galveston, because that's my grandfather back behind him. After the 1919 storm, he left and went to Tennessee and married my grandmother, who he met during World War I while he was in the hospital. The guy next to him she was a pen pal, and he started writing to her, and the guy showed him a picture of her, and he said, "I'm going to marry her." And he did. In 1920, they got married in Tennessee, and then they came to Galveston because this island here was just about gone. The 1919 come in to the south and then circled back around and took the bay water and went through Port Aransas and just about wiped it off the map, and there was not much left to work with. And he worked in Galveston for several years. My daddy was born in 1921, and his little brother was born in 1923. And then he was a commercial fisherman up there, and he decided it was time to come home. He'd been here since 1910. He quit the school in the 5th grade. Told his daddy, I want to be a fishing guide. This to be my school. And he had a mentor, Captain Ed Cotter, who they fished together a lot, and he learned a lot from him. And this is back when these were their motors. They rode everywhere out. They had one guy had a motorboat, and they'd tie onto him, and they'd pull him out to the jetties, untie where they were going to fish, and then they rode. They'd have 1 to 2 people in a skiff with them. And there's some interesting stories written in my grandfather's last book, Fishing Yesterday's Gulf Coast. It's really good stuff. I did all the artwork in it. And then James William, he wanted to retire, and so he had a brother that was already down here, Robert Ellington. He lived 3 doors down from where the Coast Guard station is. It was a life-saving station then, and right there, that was Robert Ellington's house right there. And you can see the other end down there, that's the life-saving station. And he later, I think he moved off the island probably after the 1919. A lot of people left because there was nothing left here for him to work with. And Gramps when he came back, when he was fishing here, in 1914, a storm hit, wiped out a lot of the boats. So Uncle Fred was living in Rockport at the time, working in the shipyards over there. And Gramps called him, got to him and said, you need to come over here. We need a good fishing boat, something that I know you can build. And he come over in 1915 and started Fred Farley and Son Boats with his son James Winfield. That's my grandfather there. That is Charles Frederick. An interesting story about that one. My Aunt Mabel scratched his eyes out in the picture. They had a big fight and scratched his eyes out. It's just, back then, things were hard back then. And, I hate to say it, but Uncle Fred had a drinking problem, and it eventually got to him. And see, this is Fred Farley and Son Boat. That boat right there on the biggest one right there, that's the Fish Hound. That's Florida Roberts' boat that he had built. This one here was Henry Olson's boat when he was a guide. The school here in town is named after him. He was a constable here, and he did a lot for the island. And that shop there was the first one on White Street. They had another one that was over on the corner of Station Street and Cotter, an old Shell Creek building there. Up in the top part of that building was a telephone exchange. We actually had telephones here. And down below was where the shops were. A lot of these boats were built in that shop. In fact, the race boats that Gail Morton Motzel had built, the Terrible Edith II, was built in that shop. And that's a puddle jumper there. That's one of Gail's boats. That's my Uncle Bill behind and running it. And this is my grandmother right here. He built several of them on that same design. They called them puddle jumpers. And a lot of these boats, we're not sure who owned them because the numbers that's on the boat were the old customs numbers. You got them from the customs office in Corpus. And in 1959, they changed to TX numbers. That was Sim Matthews' place on the waterfront. It was the old Matthews building. He closed that building up when his son drowned on the waterfront, fell off the docks and drowned, and he boarded it up. But Gramps' place was a little bit farther around, and he was fixing to lose his lease on it. Sim told him, well, just move over here and open the building up and run out of here. This was the last place that he ran out of. Yeah, there it is. This is the old pilot boat right there. You can judge by some of the cars in there that this is an old picture. And but at one time, well, these boats here, at one time he had 50 guides running out of his place. And there's a picture in the book, his last book, of a hammerhead shark hanging up. Well, they were getting ready to have a tournament, and the hammerhead shark was tearing everybody's fish up. So he volunteered to go out there and get rid of it. So they got a sheep from over on Harbor Island, because that's what they had, keep the grass mowed around the tank farm over there, and put it on the transom of the boat. When he got out the end of the jetties, they cut the throat, started bleeding it, and he went one direction, had his shotgun with him. And he got out there, and the hammerhead followed him. He got him. And everybody's tournament turned out to be good, because the shark's worst thing when you're trying to fish a tarpon was they'll come up and take the belly out of them or take the whole fish, depending on the size of it. But this place right here was where his nephew run out of there, Don Farley, in his boat. It's one of the boats that Roosevelt fished out of. That's my grandmother and grandfather there, born in Marie, and that's in the old Matthews building. Elliott Roosevelt had come down because he was living in San Antonio at the time. He came down with a oil man, Starter Nilsson, and they fished with Uncle Don a lot. So let's see, this is Elliott here, and this is Uncle Don there. I call him Uncle Don. He's actually a cousin, but he's older than me. And so they come in, and it was just standing around talking like all fishermen do, swapping lies. And he told him, he said, well, you ought to bring your daddy down here sometime, because he's a fisherman, and he'd probably like catching one of these. He said, yeah, I'll just do that. You take care of him, won't you? He said, yes, I will. And this, a lot of people had different stories, but I confirmed it with Elliott. I got his phone number when he lived in California, because he was a writer, very good writer. I loved his books. And I talked to him. I had Gramps' stories. He wrote 2 of them. And I had them there with me. And I started reading it off to him. He says, that's exactly how it happened. He said, back then, this is just coming out of the Depression. The president couldn't just take a vacation. He had to have a reason to take a vacation. So the trip was set up. He boarded the train in D.C., and they come down through Mississippi, New Orleans. In one of the places there, he stopped and dedicated a Confederate Veterans Memorial. Then he went on to New Orleans, and they had the parade through the town with the mayor and the governor of Louisiana and everything. And then he boarded one of the escorts, destroyer escort. I don't remember whether it was the Decatur or the Moffat that he would come out on, but as they were coming out going to the Gulf, oil line busted, shut them down, and nobody on the ship could fix it. They called the Corps engineers out. They come out and fixed it, and they come on down. The yacht was already on its way, and it anchored up there by the old lighthouse. And then they transferred him from the destroyer onto the Potomac and brought him in. He never set foot on the island. He was a guest of Sid Richardson over in, that's Uncle Don's boat right there. And one of them they were slow fishing. The one in the white hat back there, that's Roosevelt. Uncle Don's right here driving the boat, and on the other side of him is my grandfather. They fished a lot. And some days they didn't catch anything, other days they did. But when he first come in, well, he invited Gramps over to see what he wanted, how he wanted to do this, get all the plans set up. And he told him, he said, look, he said, I got a tackle room here on the yacht. Why don't you go in there and just check and see if there's any, what I need to fish with. And Gramps went in there and he was, wall to wall, rod and reels and tackle and stuff. And he come back and he said, well, I hate to disappoint you, but you got nothing small enough in there to catch alligators. He said, I will furnish your rod and reel. And at one time, my cousin Pat had the box that rod and reel was in. It's all right now. I talked to Elliot about it, and he said it was either in the Smithsonian or it's a Hyde Park Museum in New York. And the boats were all, before the war, they were built out of cypress. They had white oak frames, and they put just about any engine they could find in it. Whatever car they could pull out, old car they get an engine out of. And they engine, transmission, everything, just put it in there. And that gave them the speeds that they needed to troll for the tarpon, because it had a 3-speed transmission in it. They could adjust their speed with the engine and the transmission, sync them out, and that's what made them so great. The boats are, there's several books that mention the boats. Dr. Sutton, who was a doctor out of Kansas, he fished down here. Him and 3 other guys, they would come down, ride the old Katy train to San Antonio and get off on that, and ride another one down the Ranzas train down to Ranzas Pass, catch a taxi, come over to the island, and then they'd go fishing. And Uncle Don was one of his guides that he went with just about every time he came down. And there's a book out, it's called Silver Kings of Aransas Pass, that Dr. Sutton wrote. And he's mentioned in there several times. Took him duck hunting and different things. See that right there? That's Teddy Matthews' boat there. We called it the Marcy boat. That boat was lost during the 1945 storm at Matagorda Island. Don never went into service, but he helped out with the service people. He'd take his boat up there. That's the reason he's up there, because he's taking guys out fishing in it. My Gramps he was a chief warrant officer then. This is his second time in the military. He was in France during World War I, got gassed over there and got his finger welded to the gun case. I have a picture of him somewhere, that they had to do surgery on the finger, and this finger here is actually shorter than his little finger. And that's when he met my grandmother. Now that's my Uncle Barney there. He was a instruments instructor up in Brady, Texas. He was in the military up there. That's my daddy and my grandmother, my mother and my oldest brother. He wasn't very old. He was born in 44. And so, my daddy he entered the service in 1940. He was an aircraft mechanic, and later in the war they were needing operators for the crash boats. And in fact, in one of my wooden boat magazines, there was an article about Matagorda Island and the people that were there, and I talked to one of the guys, and he said, yeah, I remember that. Well, my grandfather, he was in charge of morale at the Matagorda up there, and some of the pilots, when they were doing bombing practice, they would spot schools of fish. they would radio it back to the base. He'd take the boat, they'd go out there and catch fish in the net and bring it back in. Everybody ate fish that day. And my grandmother, she took care of the officers club up there at Matagorda. She had a paper that said that she could be out after curfew, signed by the commanding officer. And she was on her way back up there one time with a load of alcohol for the club. And one of the local sheriffs or something stopped her, wanted to know what she was doing out, where she was going, what are you doing with all this alcohol? And she's explaining to him. So finally she told him, well, you call the commanding officer at the base. And they went back to the station, he called, and the commanding officer read him the riot act, and he said, under no circumstances are you to stop that woman any other time. She has a free pass. And he said, yes, ma'am. You go. No more trouble. But my daddy they wanted anybody that had any boat experience. And, well, he'd been around boats all of his life. He had his captain's license when he was 18 years old. And 1938. 39, 38, something like that. So he volunteered to go down to Matagorda. He was actually a crash boat instructor for a while, and then he got transferred overseas to the Philippines. He's on Mindanao Air Sea Rescue. The boats here, there was a transition from the ones like the model is back there. And then after the war, they started putting a little shelter house on them. And they started putting gray Marines in them, Chryslers, because there was a surplus after the war of these engines, and they had Marine transmissions. And during the war, they weren't able to get a hold of Cyprus because it went into a lot of stuff that the war effort. And so after the war, they started building them out of mahogany. And like I said, the cabin, some of the older tarpon boats, they would add a shelter house to them. Okay, this boat right here is a Bill Pat 2. All the interior woodwork was teak down in the cabin. That's one of the Revell boys right there. He helped Uncle Jim, that's him right there, do all the woodwork for teak because he had worked with it once before. And that boat there, there's pictures of it. They're putting it in the wall. This is a second shop on White Street. This is the one where a lot of the newer boats, all the newer boats were built. I don't know exactly when that shop was built. I know that it was there during the war because Teddy Matthews stayed on the island, and he kept the shop open and repaired boats and did stuff, worked on for people on the island. And this is a fly bridge that went on the top of it. The guy standing up, that's Fred Jr. Buster Noakes with the funny hat on, and the other one underneath, that's Bubba Molina. Little Fred was born in 1916 up in the attic of the house during the storm. Uncle Fred took all the doors off the inside of the house, put them up in the attic, and that's where Aunt Mabel had him. They had the three boys and, let's see, and Bobby and Pickett, and three girls. Don McLeod and Uncle Jim were born in Columbus, Georgia, and the rest of them were born here. Now that right there, the guy leaning against the boat, that's Uncle Bill. And this is probably one of Gail's race boats. We're not sure. I know it's not the Terrible Edith because the transom's not right on it. And that there is the Seawolf. That's Burton Curry's boat, and the names are all down along the bottom there. It was a single engine. It was the same hull as my daddy's boat. And but he only had a single engine, and he had a GM 455 or something like that. And he run a lot of boats. He worked for some private. He run private boats for a long time, and for a lot of the different. There was a lot of different people that had. Oh, they had pacemakers and hatters, and there was another one. They all tied up over their boathouses on the other side of the harbor, was Turtle Cove, and there's some big people. That's the Boatmen's Association, 1932. That was the first one. A lot of these guys, I can pick them out. One on the far end, that's Yancey Gillespie Sr. I think this is Woody Owsley right here. He used to have Woody's boat basin. And then my grandmother's right here. This is Johnny Mercer. And my grandfather's right there. That's Uncle Bill. This is Elmo Bouillon. And this is Dennis Dyer.
I threw that in there because you said almost all the boatmen ended up working on boats in the boat shop.
Yeah, and they, well, the names are all down on the bottom. It's hard to read them because the tape that was on the picture it's kind of disintegrated. But that was the first Boatmen's Association. Gramps organized that. He did a lot of work for the boatmen down here. Him and Grady Kinsloving started the Tarpon Rodeo in 1932. It was originally a contest between the boatmen. The people that they took out, they just caught the fish. They were just a fixture. The contest was between the boatmen. They were the ones that won the awards, won the trophies. And a lot of those guys, they worked out of his place. And that was kind of a uniform for them at the time, that when they took pictures. And that's a picture of my cousin Philip with Uncle Jim. That's in front of the Farley Boat Works, which wasn't started, that name didn't come into effect until 1965 when they moved the shop over there. The reason it was moved because that property belonged to Dr. Schatz out of San Antonio, and he wanted a new boat. So they built a new shop, and that's when it was changed to Farley Boat Works. My cousin Don Roy built skiffs in the back of the shop. He had a little shop built in there, and he built skiffs in there for a while. We're not sure. The boat there, that's one of the style cabins that they had on them. And they come about in the 50s, like that. That's the Lady B. That's her standing there, and her husband right next to her, Paul Millsap, and that's my cousin Fred right there. Paul was some high up in Hum Oil Company. This was taken right across the street from the old shop on White Street. The Lady B, after Paul sold it, it was run by two school teachers from Flower Bluff. They run the boat charter fishing, and then later it was sold to, I'm trying to think of the guy's name. Who was that guy, Ned?
I don't know, but they renamed it.
Yeah, you're like me, you're drawing a blank. I know it started with an S. He did a lot of work here on the island. But the boat, the old trailers and stuff they use, And that model back there shows what the trailers looked like back then. They were cut out on an old bandsaw that he had. Originally, the bandsaw was run with an old, I believe it was an old Chevrolet engine. They'd crank it up, get it running, and it had a 36-inch table on it. And then later on, they got an electric motor for it. It was the only place on the island that had three-phase power to it. And the starters on it were bad, and it covered it up with a number 3 wash tub when he wasn't using it. He'd go out there and lift the tub up, throw the breaker, get up there and kick it with his foot and get it started. And it'd slowly start turning. And you could tell when it was ready to cut. It had a singing noise to it. And I've seen him go in and take measurements for a plank and then lay it out on the table, and then he'd take it out to the saw, and he'd very carefully, very slowly run it through the saw. And then he'd take it in on his bench, put it in the vise there and a stop on the end, and he'd take a plane and he'd start at one end and he'd walk down to the other end, continuous curl of wood coming out of it. He grew up in the boat shop. I think he was about 10, 11 years old when he started. And yeah, now that was my daddy's boat there. It was built the winter, last part of 52. We put it in the water on my birthday in 1953. It was 32 foot long, had 1-inch mahogany planking on it. It had white oak frames. The planking was interesting too because there were still scars. There were scars from the war where bullets had ripped through the trees, and had 2 Nordberg 110 horsepower engines in it. As you can see, it's all mahogany, every bit of it. And the boat was built to run in the oil fields, in the bays during the wintertime, off season. And he would lease out to Sunray Oil Company. And that's Uncle Jim and my daddy right there. Newspaper article that appeared in the New Corpus newspaper. He was short. That's another picture of it right there running out. That's St. Joe Island on the back, in the background there. My oldest brother is just sticking his head out there. I'm just right behind him. You can't hardly, that picture, you can't see me in the picture, but I'm there. I was in the first grade, and when he was still fishing with it, and I would, as soon as class is out, I was gone. I headed to the docks, and I'd meet him at the docks down there. Usually he was gassing up, and I would climb in and take it around, back it into the slip. Of course, he's right there with me, but I was doing it. And he had an old coat case, wooden coat case that he stood on to run the boat. But it took a lot of people come to this island and fished with different boatmen. Most of them went out of Gramps' place. Like I said, Elliot Roosevelt, Sid Richardson, he was real good friends with Sid Richardson, who at that time owned St. Joe Island. Mr. Fairbanks from Fairbanks Morris Engine Company. Amy McPherson, she fished down here. She came down one time. He took Dr. Sutton out, he come through the place. And you can see the boats were a little different as far as the windscreen were. But basically, the boat was the same. They used the same hull, and there was never any plans for the boat. When they got ready to build one, they took 1/4-inch plywood and laid it out on the floor and drew it out. We call lofting, and they had so many of them drawn on there that it got to where they had to use a different colored ink every time. And that's another picture there. I think that boat is the,
Starfish.
I think that's the Osita. That was George Haunt, no. That was Dean's boat, wasn't it?
No, that's the Starfish that Bill's got on Lone Star.
Yeah. And that's Uncle Jim standing there in the back, and then that's my stepfather right there beside him. They got along great. And there was always a boat at the shop, always a boat being worked on. That and there was twin engine. The Tina boat was built for Sam Cone. And he had a problem with one of the boatmen or something running off with his wife or something like that. That's the story we got. And he put it in the barn. And that's where that boat stayed. And he had Uncle Jim build him another one. Actually, he hadn't built two, because later on, Little Fred bought the other one from him and called it the Grace. It had just a little windscreen on it and portholes in the cabin. One of the few boats that had portholes. And they were real good friends with Sam and Grace, and he taught her how to drive out on the old runway, which was just a shell strip in an old truck. Taught her how to drive out there. She remember her telling me all about that. And then later on, he had him build another one that Uncle Oscar ran for him, called it the Goose Egg. Oscar was married to Uncle Jim's sister, Aunt Tizzy. And he was the JP here on the island at the time. And got me out of a ticket once. I was going a little fast on the beach. Kids. I went by and visited with him, and while I was there, I remember looking it was in his garage working on a cabinet or something, and there was another door going into the other side, and I remember seeing another boat there. And it wasn't a big boat. And I've got a picture of him, he's just running the boat, and that was it. But he never talked about it, so okay. I asked him about it, and he wouldn't tell me nothing. That was the way it was back then. You didn't ask a lot of questions, because sometimes there was just something that they didn't want to talk about. But that's a song that my grandfather wrote for my grandmother. He composed the words on one of his trips back to Matagorda Island. He'd come up with the words for it, and there was a music teacher here in Port Aransas at the school, and she helped him put the music to words. And he recorded that on a record, but we don't have any of that anymore. It's just the storms wipe out stuff, and you don't have it. But he played the guitar, played it pretty good. This is one of their trips out to take people fishing for the tournament, the Tarpon Rodeo, 1936. They had a lot of sponsors. If can't read what it is on the back of them, but some of them were sponsored by Shakespeare, the Rod and Reel Company. And it was, ooh, where'd it go?
Last one,
Oh, that was the last one.
but we skipped over some.
Oh,
Back and check out.
yeah, let's go back here. Let's see what we got here.
That was the inside of
Oh,
this place.
that was Florida Roberts there standing up there by the fish. And in Florida, this is one of the rare pictures you ever see him with shoes. He didn't wear shoes. And but he had won a tournament or something, and that was his prize money right there. The Gramps is giving him the check. That's some of the trophies that they got for let's go back. That right there is in the shop on White Street. That's my daddy's boat being built right there. And that's Uncle Jim there. That's that Yankee screwdriver he's got in his hand. I've seen him start to screw in the hole, stick that thing up there and hit it about 3 times, and the screw's buried. That's how well that screwdriver worked. And all that lumber stacked there behind him is the planking and underneath. And yeah. Now that's my grandpa right there.
That's James Williams.
I think that's a picture of the ship they're supposed to come over on. Here. I don't know where they got that picture from. I don't think cameras were working very good back then. Especially out on the ocean, you know. But, you know, we have interesting history. We fought in just about every war that's taken place. Revolutionary War, Civil War. Had my great-grandfather was at the Battle of Mariana, Florida, and he got captured because they lost the battle. But it was late at night. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning when they were going to march him back to Pensacola and then ship him off north to the prison camp. And they had, a lot of people loaded up in the wagons, and a lot of them were walking. And the provost marshal asked him if he wanted to ride in the wagon. He says, "No, I walk." I said, I walk all the time. I walk. He said, "Suit yourself, old man." So, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. All these soldiers are tired because they had force marched them from Pensacola up to Mariana. And so he's watching them, and he kept watching them doze off. And he caught him dozing off one too many times, and he's out through the swamp. They shot at him, but it didn't hit him. And his brother had been captured twice, and he had come home. He was released, but his papers hadn't come back through yet. So if he'd have been caught, they'd have shot him as a spy. So he dropped down in a ditch and made it back to the house. He's sitting there having breakfast the next morning when Grandpa William come in and had breakfast with him. And then Gramps, he loved to fish. He loved to meet people. And he was one of those kind of that he really didn't meet strangers. And I've met people at his house when I was a kid growing up. We happened to be in the house or stopped by there, and We didn't know who they were. But later on, I'd be reading something and I'd talking to Daddy about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, you met them at Grandma's house." He said, "They used to come all the time." The guy from Hemphill McCombs, Mr. Hemphill, they used to come down here, and they knew each other. I mean, the people that he met is just hard to believe that some of them, and I've met them and didn't even know it.
Where was that house located?
Hmm?
Where was that house located?
The what?
Is that the house that was on 12th and?
Oh, no, the one, well, on 12th Street too, because, see, he built the house up on the hill on 12th, at corner of 12th and Avenue G. Uncle Fred built that house for him. That's an interesting house too, because it had a big porch out on the front, big columns and stuff, but they were all square. And of course, it's not until after we're grown up and Daddy starts telling me stories about this house. He said you could go into the attic on one side of Gramps' office up there, crawl through, come down. There was a ladder in each one of those columns. And you could walk across and climb back up and go to the other side without ever being seen. Well, during Prohibition, a whole lot of alcohol washed up on the beach being transported up from Mexico. What they do, they take their crates and they put salt in them. So if the revenuers got at them, they'd throw them over the side. They'd sink. As soon as the salt melted out, they'd float to the top and wash up on the beach. So they were all, and their house, above the porch was a balcony. And you could see, if you stood out on that balcony at that time, you could see the South Jetties, and just as far as your vision would take you, down the south end of the island. And fact is, during one of the rodeos, Gaines Hicks had his party out, and a squall blew up. He lost power on his engine. He was trying to make it in, but he couldn't make it around the jetty, so he went for the beach. Well, he landed up on the beach, and Gaines, he helped the people. There were 3 or 4 people on the boat with him. His daughter was his deckhand. And they got word that back at the headquarters that he hadn't made it back in yet, so Dewey Dreyer went to Gramps' house, got out there on the balcony, a pair of binoculars, and just as he was focusing them in, he spotted the boat. He called him, told him where it was, and they got the boat out on the beach, carried it back up to Uncle Jim's shop. It was too far gone to be able to repair. And the boatman took up a collection and bought him another boat. And he named it My Friends. And I have a picture somewhere of Ava Jean sitting up on the bow with her little, I think it was a little chihuahua. And, but Dewey found him, and there was only one person died, but he had a heart attack. He was kind of overweight and stuff, and getting him up on the beach, and he didn't make it. That was the only fatality in the whole thing. And they managed to go on with the rodeo, and after the weather cleared. But this is back before they had the newscasts that we have now. There was no radar checking to see where the storm was or how the weather was. Fact is, the first person that flew into the eye of a storm flew out of Pensacola, Florida during the war. He was a pilot, and he flew out. The storm was coming in, and he flew out there and investigated it. Took a reading on where it was at, kind of which way it was going. That was the first report of, first time that anybody had actually done anything like that. And but we've had a lot of storms hit this island. Some of them really bad. In 1919, Celia, 1970. Harvey, 2017. A lot of people lost a lot of stuff in Harvey. They weren't. If you go around and look at some of the houses here, in fact, there's one right over here on the other side of the church, two over there on the other side of the church. One of them was the Smith house, and it didn't sit up high like that. It was down probably this high off the ground, and it managed to go through the storm. Some of the older houses, they did that because the way they were built. They used diagonal shiplap siding, and they went from the bottom plate all the way to the top plate, and it's all nailed together. And the old Brundert house over here on Brundert Street, and I forget what the name of the other street is, they're right on the corner. His walls are this thick. That's all they were. And they were shiplap siding, and it's been through every storm that's hit since that house was built. And I was talking to Johnny, one of Ansel's sons. I said, well, during Celia, where was the water? He said, well, it was down there. It was come up right to the bottom of the porch. And that was it. Didn't get in the house. And they finally had to redo the house a little bit because Social Security said they had to use up their money. They were stockpiling their checks, and he said, no, you can't do that. And Johnny was taking care of things, so he said, well, look, if we put the money in the house, fix it. Yeah, we can do that. So he had a contractor come in and do a bunch of work. Me and Mark Teller put an AC unit in the house. That's when I got to talking to Johnny about it. And I worked for Ansel for one summer, the taxidermy shop. Me and his son Ben, we worked over in the skinning shop. That's an old shop way over there, close to the waterfront. And we were the fish skinners. Ansel was one of the few that used the skin off the fish to make the mount. The bodies were paper mache. I did all that with them. When we had all of our fish skinned up, we'd have to go over to the new shop and work with the guys over there building the bodies, building molds, just whatever. I could mount you one. Couldn't paint it. I didn't get into that part of it. Ansel was the only one that painted. And when he painted one, it looked like it was just, you're fixing to pull it out of the water. All the colors, everything. Uncle Jim, I used to talk to him a lot building boats when he was building them. Summertime, I practically lived at the shop. When I lived on the island, I was down at the shop. I was watching the boats build. There's a lot of these boats I saw built. And it was an art that he had. And I wished I'd have got to work with him a little bit more than what I did. But I used to talk to him a lot about the boats, and he'd talk to me about them. Tell me why he did things a certain way. He was, my cousin Philip, when he was growing up here on the island, my Aunt Mary brought her 3 boys down here from George West. And Philip wasn't very old, but one day he come packing a hand grenade home. Where did you get that? Up at the old gun emplacement. You see, a lot of people don't know that down below them is a big room. And when he come up with that, she got the boatman name. They went up there and caved that in. It was dangerous. They ain't no telling what kind of stuff still down in them holes out there. He still admits to that. He let some prisoners out of the jail one time too. It was just more of a flat metal cage sit down on the waterfront close to the Coast Guard station. And he was walking by there, and they were in there for drunken disorder. No big deal. Bad guys. And they talked him into opening the door for him. He opened them up and let him out. Just some of the things that happen on the island. Oh.
Let's try to show a picture of the house.
When the president came down and fished, there was 3 boatmen used. Their names out of a hat. There was Ed Tarrant, Teddy Matthews, and Don Farley. Don and Teddy's boats were all built by my uncle. Ed's boat was a 1935 25-foot Chris crab. And he fished with them first. They didn't catch anything that day. And so, later, when he went out with Uncle Don and Teddy, they caught a fish. Gramps went all the way down to Port Isabel with him on the yacht. It's not recorded, but he recorded it. He told me all about it. On the way down, there was a shrimp boat over there, and they lowered the boat, and he went over to the shrimp boat and told him, hey, that's the President of the United States over there. He'd like to have some shrimp. They started shoveling shrimp in the back end of the boat and carried it over, and his Philippine club prepared it, and they ate good. He went all the way to Port Isabel with him, and they wanted to take Uncle Don and Teddy's boat down there. They wanted to put them up on one of the destroyers. He said, no, and Uncle Don wasn't too fine about it either, so they didn't do that. They just used the boats that was down there. The fishing wasn't that great, but should have been, but it wasn't. Then
He came back here. He fished with Teddy after he went down South Padre.
Yeah. He came back with him, and then he left. And during the time that he was here, when Roosevelt was here, it's in the log, the Hindenburg went down. And there's a copy of the telegram that he sent to Adolf with his condolences for the people that were lost on the Hindenburg. That's in the log too.
Yeah, we have the logs in the museum if you ever want to look at them.
Yeah, I have a copy of the log over here if you want to see it. I have a lot of stuff. My daddy wrote a lot of stories about his childhood on the island, and I have all of them, and some of the stuff they pulled. We probably wouldn't be able to sit down if we'd have pulled them. I don't know how he managed, but they caught an armadillo one time. Threw it in the back of they had an old Buick with a humpback trunk. And him and his brother and some of the others, they threw this thing in the back of the chart, and then it drove around the island, figuring what they're going to do with it. Well, they backed up to one of the beer joints. And a bunch of Australians in there and they just opened it up. Well, by that time, the armadillo's ready to come out. He went through the building, and the Aussies come out. They'd never seen anything like that, and they come out of there. And, it's just stuff like that. Like I said, if we'd have pulled it, probably still be standing up.
Keith, I think some people, I can kind of hear.
Yeah.
We're going to have to go and they have some.
I'll tell you, yes, sir.
How many boats did your family make, and
How many did they build?
how many did they build, how many are still around, and
Well,
and what happened to the tarpon?
I have a list of boats from that goes back probably around 1920, somewhere along in there, all the way up to 1970, when the Hurricane Celia come through and wiped out a lot of the boats. And I have a list of them. And some of them I actually have the names of who the people that the boat belonged to. I have it in my big notebook over here if you want to look at it. But I had at one time something like 200 boats that Uncle Fred and Uncle Jim built. Now, Uncle Fred died in December 1936. And the boat he was working on, that they were working on at the time, Uncle Jim had to finish it. It was built for Joe Tracy. And Uncle Jim hated that boat. And you could always pick it out when it's sitting at the dock. You didn't have to see the name. You could look over and you see the boat. It had a permanent list to it. And they did everything in the world that they could to get that boat to sit level in the water. Never did. He hated that boat. He had to finish it after his daddy died. And I talked to little Joe. He inherited the boat from his daddy. And I talked to him about it one time. I said, how's that boat run out there? He said, once you get it opened up, just as smooth and straight as it can be. He said, back at the dock, that's a different story. But, you know, it was, there's a lot of history on the island here, the boats and the people that came here, the people that lived here, that it's, you know, a lot of them are forgotten because they didn't have any relatives to follow in their footsteps, or they didn't want to follow in their footsteps. The Brunards, the taxidermies, none of the boys wanted to do it anymore. They didn't want to do it. And so the shop closed. Uncle Jim closed his shop in 1972. He moved to George West, built a house up there. In 1974, I was taking a shower, and my sister come in and beating on the door. Uncle Jim died. And, you know, he went just like he said he wanted to do. He said, I want to come in from work, I'll lay my hammer down, and want to die. He'd been out doing something on the house. He'd come in for lunch like he always did. He ate and did exactly the same as I'd seen him do all my life. He went in and took a nap. And he was in there a little while. He called Aunt Mary in there, and they got him to the hospital over in Beeville, and she asked the doctor, what could I have done? She said, nothing. There wasn't nothing we could have done if he'd been right here in the hospital. But that was the way it was. He lived a full life. He was like, I don't know, 65, 66. But that's the way things happen on the island. And the old ones, there's not very many old islanders left. But one dies, there's two more go with them. The 3 in a row. That's the way it's always been. But I'll tell you, I've probably talked long enough and bored enough people. So I'm going to turn it over to Cliff and let him, if there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to.
You don't have any more questions?
Thank you.
Looks like there's a couple questions in the back there.
Where was this located?
What's that?
Where was the whole works located?
So the original one was on, and we have a picture of this building, it was underneath the telephone company on the corner of Cotter and Station Street. Just thumbs, bar, go right across stage from there. And then the second was just really almost on the same block on Light Street Pier Station. And then the last one. That's where the starfish where it is on average. Most of those are local.
You got family here? You got family here? You got boys and kids and
No,
grandkids?
I've got a cousin that still lives on the island. He's in the That's just about his sister. Yep.
Hi.
Yeah, he still lives here. I know. And when you get ready to do yours,
No, I've been talking to people here.
I'll be more than happy to help you.
Well,
As you can tell, I'm full of shit.